What would you do if you woke up one morning and the river that sustained your entire world had turned the color of blood? Welcome to this journey into one of the most haunting environmental mysteries in American history, a story so thoroughly buried that entire generations have forgotten it ever happened. But before we descend into these dark waters, I need you to ask yourself, how much death can a community endure before it stops being a community? How many lies can the powerful tell before truth becomes irrelevant? Tell us where you're watching from right now, and whether you believe corporations should face the same consequences as individuals when they kill, because by the end of this account, you may question everything you thought you knew about justice, memory, and the price we pay for forgetting. This episode contains detailed discussions of death, environmental disaster, industrial negligence, and community tragedy involving real historical events. The details included serve understanding, not sensationalism, but they are disturbing. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. In the archives of the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection, there exists a photograph that shouldn't exist, an image from August 19, 1947, showing the Elk River running crimson under a pale morning sun, not metaphorically red, not rust-colored or brown. Red like arterial blood, red like warning, red like the inside of something that should have stayed closed. The photograph is stamped classified and remained hidden for 67 years. What you're about to discover is a mystery that killed 43 people over 72 hours, where industrial progress crossed a line that erased an entire valley's way of life, leaving a legacy so toxic that the land itself remains poisoned to this day. This isn't just history. This is a question about what we're willing to sacrifice in the name of prosperity, and who gets to make that decision. It was the year 1947. America was basking in post-war triumph. The economy was booming, and industrial manufacturing had become the new national religion. In boardrooms from New York to Chicago, executives spoke reverently of progress, of production, of the future. But in the remote valleys of central West Virginia, progress was about to reveal its true face, and that face was death. Let me take you to a place that doesn't exist anymore, not officially, not on any current map you'll find. The town was called Elkmouth, a name that told you everything you needed to know about its geography and nothing about its soul. Nestled where Sweetwater Creek met the Elk River, Elkmouth sat in a valley so narrow that sunlight only reached the main street for 4 hours a day in summer, 2 in winter. The mountains rose on either side like the walls of a cathedral, dark with ancient oak and hemlock, their peaks perpetually shrouded in mist that the locals called the breath, as if the land itself were alive and sighing. 317 people called Elkmouth home in the summer of 1947. 317 souls who knew every secret about one another, who shared blood and grudges and Sunday dinners, who lived by the rhythm of the river that had sustained this valley for 10,000 years. The Elk River wasn't just water. It was life itself, cold and clear as crystal, so pure you could drink straight from it without fear. It provided fish, smallmouth bass, brown trout, channel catfish that grew as long as a man's arm. It powered the small mill on the eastern edge of town where oak was cut into railroad ties. It gave the children a place to swim in summer, their laughter echoing off the mountain walls. And it connected Elkmouth to the wider world, flowing north toward Charleston, carrying their timber, their stories, their prayers downstream. But 8 miles upstream, beyond the bend where Sugar Creek emptied in from the west, beyond the place where the valley narrowed to a throat of stone, something else had come to the river. The Consolidated Chemical and Dye Corporation had built their facility in 1940, during the war, when regulations were suggestions and patriotism meant asking no questions. The plant manufactured aniline dyes, deep blues and vivid reds used for military uniforms, for naval flags, for the fabric of American victory. 600 workers made the journey up the mountain road each day, many of them from Elkmouth itself, grateful for wages that dwarfed what the timber mill could offer. Nobody in Elkmouth asked what chemicals went into making those colors. Nobody questioned the occasional strange smell that drifted down valley on east winds bitter and acrid, like burning copper mixed with something organic and wrong. Nobody complained when the company dumped their waste into a ravine behind the plant, assuring everyone that the containment was state-of-the-art and absolutely safe. Progress, after all, required trust, and trust required silence. James Theodore Macklin was 67 years old in August of 1947, a man so deeply rooted in Elkmouth that people joked he'd sprout leaves if you planted him. He'd been the ferryman for 43 years, rowing supplies and occasionally people across the river at the narrow crossing where the current ran smooth and deep. Every morning at dawn, without fail, James walked down to the riverbank to check the water level, to inspect his boat, to begin his day the way his father had, and his father's father before him. On the morning of August 17, 1947, James Theodore Macklin walked to the river and stopped dead. Later, when they asked him to describe it, he would struggle. Wrong. He kept saying, it was just wrong. The color, yes, that orange tint that hadn't been there yesterday, like someone had dissolved iron in the water. But it was more than color. The smell hit him 10 feet from the bank, metallic and sharp, with an underneath note of something chemical that made his eyes water. And the sound, that's what really unsettled him. The river, which normally sang as it rolled over stones, now made a thick, sluggish sound. Heavier, like something was dissolving in it. James did what any practical man would do. He went to Sheriff Coleman Briggs. Coleman Briggs was 41 years old, rail, thin, with hands that bore the scars of a man who'd worked coal before he wore a badge. He'd been sheriff for 6 years, and in that time he'd dealt with exactly 3 serious crimes, 1 bar fight that turned bloody, 1 case of livestock theft, and 1 domestic situation that ended with a man sleeping in the jail for his own protection. Elkmouth didn't generate much trouble. It was the kind of place where people settled things quietly, where law was more about keeping the peace than seeking justice. When James described the river, Coleman's first instinct was to dismiss it. Rivers change color, sometimes runoff from rain, seasonal algae, natural minerals. Nothing to panic about, but James was insistent, and James wasn't a man given to exaggeration. They walked to the river together, Coleman and James, in that peculiar morning light that made everything look slightly unreal. And Coleman saw immediately that James hadn't been exaggerating. If anything, he'd understated it. The Elk River, that ancient artery of cold mountain water, had taken on the color of rust and old blood. But it wasn't uniform, that was the disturbing part. Swirls of orange mixed with streaks of dark red, creating patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost purposeful. Like something was bleeding into the river upstream, and the current was trying desperately to dilute it. We need to follow it, Coleman said quietly, see where it's coming from. They took Coleman's truck, driving upstream along the rutted road that paralleled the river. With every mile, the color deepened, the smell intensified, and both men felt a growing dread that neither would speak aloud. The recognition that whatever was happening wasn't natural, wasn't small, and wasn't going to stop on its own. 3 miles up, they found the first dead fish, then another, then dozens, then hundreds. The fish hadn't just died, they'd been destroyed from the inside out. Their gills were bright red, swollen to bursting. Their scales had a strange, chemical sheen. Some had foam around their mouths, others had blood seeping from their eyes. They floated belly up in rafts of death, covering the surface of the water in places so thick you couldn't see the river beneath. "Jesus Christ," James whispered, making the sign of the cross. "Jesus Christ Almighty." But this is where the story takes its first dark turn, because Coleman and James didn't know yet that fish were the least of it. By noon on August 17th, word had spread through Elkmouth like fever. The river was wrong, poisoned, changed. Families who'd drawn water that morning for coffee now stared at their cups with suspicion. Mothers kept children away from the banks. Fishermen pulled their nets and boats to shore, securing them as if protecting them from a flood that hadn't come yet. But 32 people in Elkmouth worked at the consolidated chemical plant Upstream. 32 breadwinners who made the journey up that mountain road 5 days a week, who brought home wages that fed their families, paid for new shoes, kept the lights on. And 32 was enough to create a terrible conflict in a town of 317. Robert Ellis Calhoun was one of those 32. He was 39 years old, a shift supervisor at the plant, a man who wore his authority like a coat he'd been given but didn't quite fit. He had a wife, Margaret, called Maggie, 37 years old, with hands perpetually stained from the vegetable garden she tended like it was holy ground. He had 2 daughters, Sarah, 14, who dreamed of college in a way that made her father proud and terrified in equal measure, and Clara, 9, who collected river stones and could name every bird by its call. When Coleman went to the plant that afternoon, Robert met him at the gate. "Sheriff," Robert said, his tone carefully neutral. "Something I can help you with." "Need to speak with your plant manager," Coleman replied, "about the river." Robert's face did something complicated, a flicker of recognition, then defensiveness, then careful blankness. "River's fine. Little discoloration maybe, some runoff from the processing, but nothing to worry about. Well within acceptable parameters. Fish don't think so," Coleman said quietly. "River's full of dead fish, Robert, miles of them." For just a moment Robert's mask slipped. Coleman saw fear there, and recognition, and something that looked like guilt. But then the mask returned, harder than before. "I'll get Mr. Harrison," Robert said. "Curtis J." Harrison was the plant manager, a man who'd come from Ohio 5 years earlier with credentials from 3 different chemical companies and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He was 52 years old, impeccably dressed even in the industrial setting of the plant, and he possessed a remarkable gift for making the unacceptable sound entirely reasonable. "Sheriff Briggs," Harrison said warmly, extending a hand that Coleman didn't take. "I understand there's some concern about river quality. Let me assure you, our facility operates well within all federal and state guidelines. We conduct regular testing." "Your facility is poisoning the river," Coleman interrupted. "I've seen it. Dead fish for miles, water that smells like a chemical spill." Harrison's smile never wavered. "What you're seeing is a temporary discoloration due to some minor adjustment in our processing. Perfectly normal, perfectly safe. The river has tremendous capacity to absorb and neutralize minor industrial discharge. Nature is quite remarkable that way. How minor? I'm not at liberty to discuss specific operational details," Harrison said smoothly. "Trade secrets, you understand. But I can absolutely assure you, I need you to stop." Coleman said, "Whatever you're dumping, whatever's causing this, you need to stop it now." Harrison's smile finally faded. "Sheriff, I appreciate your concern for the community, but this facility operates under federal authority due to our defense contracts. Any cessation of operations would require approval from the Department of Defense. We're producing materials essential to national security. I'm sure you understand that the needs of the nation must, occasionally, take precedence over local aesthetics. The word hung in the air like poison. Aesthetics, as if dead fish were just unsightly, as if the lifeblood of an entire valley was merely decorative. Coleman felt something cold settle in his gut. He recognized in that moment that he was facing something beyond his capacity to fight not just a man, but a system, a structure of power that had already decided what mattered and what didn't. And Elkmouth, for all its history and hope, had been placed firmly in the didn't category. People drink from that river, Coleman said quietly. Then I'd advise them to use their wells until the discoloration clears. Harrison replied, should be no more than a few days, week at most. 3 days, it turned out. That's all it took, but what they found next would haunt investigators for decades. Emily Grace Thornton was 6 years old, and she loved the river more than anything in the world, except possibly her grandmother's blackberry pie. She had hair the color of wheat in August sun, eyes the deep brown of river stones, and a laugh that made adults smile even when they were trying to be stern. On the afternoon of August 17th, while adults argued about acceptable parameters and federal authority, Emily did what she'd done every summer afternoon of her short life. She went to the river to play. Her mother, Catherine Thornton, was hanging laundry in the backyard. She'd heard about the river. Of course, the whole town had heard by then, but she'd also heard Robert Calhoun assure people at the general store that morning that it was nothing serious, just a bit of color. Besides, Emily wasn't going to swim. She was just going to collect stones for her collection, stay in the shallow part, be back before supper. Catherine would replay this decision for the rest of her life. Every detail, every moment, every rationalization that led to her saying yes, but don't get wet, and be back in an hour. Emily never came back. They found her at dusk, lying in the shallows where Sweetwater Creek met the river. She'd been collecting stones. There were 7 of them clutched in her left hand, beautiful smooth river agates, still wet from the water. Her right hand was in the river, and her dress was soaked from the knees down. She was unconscious, barely breathing, and when Sheriff Coleman Briggs lifted her from the water, her skin had a strange, chemical smell that made his eyes water. Dr. Matthias Webb was 71 years old, and had been practicing medicine in Elkmouth for 43 years. He'd delivered most of the children in town, set most of their broken bones, seen most of them through scarlet fever and whooping cough and the various disasters of rural childhood. He'd seen death, certainly. Age and accident took their toll even in peaceful valleys, but he'd never seen anything like Emily Grace Thornton. Her skin was red where it had touched the water, not sunburned but chemically burned, blistering in places. Her breathing was shallow and labored. Her heart rate was erratic, and when he examined her pupils, they were dilated far beyond what they should be, fixed and unresponsive. "What's wrong with her?" Catherine Thornton begged, gripping his arm with fingers that left bruises. "What's wrong with my baby?" "Chemical exposure," Matthias said grimly. "Something in the water, something toxic." He turned to Coleman. "We need to get her to Charleston, to a real hospital. They might have treatments I don't." The drive to Charleston Memorial Hospital took 2 hours. 2 hours during which Emily Grace Thornton convulsed twice, vomited blood once, and briefly stopped breathing until Matthias forced air into her small lungs with his own breath. Catherine rode in the back seat, holding her daughter, singing lullabies in a voice that cracked and broke but never stopped. Emily died at 11:47 that night, with her mother still singing. The cause of death, according to the Charleston Hospital's report, Acute chemical poisoning consistent with exposure to industrial toxins. Specific agent unknown. Recommend investigation of environmental contamination. She was the first, but she wouldn't be the last. By dawn on August 18th, the river had deepened to a color that defied simple description. Not red, not orange, not rust. Something between all three, something that looked like the earth itself was bleeding. The smell had intensified too, spreading through the valley on the morning mist, infiltrating homes and lungs and dreams. And people were getting sick. Not everyone, not even most, but enough. The pattern was clear to anyone paying attention. Those who'd had contact with the river water were falling ill. Not immediately, not all at once, but over hours. Sudden onset of nausea, vomiting, respiratory distress, skin lesions, neurological symptoms. Thomas Grant, 43, who'd washed his car with river water the previous afternoon, hospitalized with severe chemical burns to his hands and respiratory distress. Patricia Holloway, 31, who'd rinsed vegetables from her garden with river water, violently ill, unable to keep food down, confused and disoriented. Michael Yates, 17, who'd gone swimming despite warnings, showing off for a girl he liked. Critical condition with skin lesions covering 40% of his body. By noon, 12 people were hospitalized. By sunset, 23. And the river kept flowing, kept changing, kept spreading its poison downstream toward Charleston, toward communities that didn't even know yet what was coming for them. Sheriff Coleman Briggs stood on the riverbank that evening, watching the dying light turn the water into something that looked like a wound. Around him, the town was fracturing. Fear does that. It finds the cracks in community and pries them wide open. Half the town wanted to storm the chemical plant, to shut it down by force if necessary. The other half, mostly families of those 32 workers, argued for patience, for not jumping to conclusions, for remembering that those jobs fed children and paid mortgages and represented the only prosperity Elkmouth had ever known. We don't know for certain it's the plant. Robert Calhoun argued at the emergency town meeting that night, his voice steady despite the sweat beading on his forehead. Could be something natural, underground minerals, some kind of geological event. My daughter is dead, Catherine Thornton said from the back of the room, her voice so quiet everyone had to strain to hear it. Dead from playing in the river, and you want to talk about maybe. The silence that followed was absolute. I'm sorry, Robert said finally. Jesus God, Catherine, I'm so sorry about Emily, but nothing, she interrupted. Your plant is killing us, and you know it. You all know it. You go up there every day, and you see what they're doing, and you say nothing because the money's good. How good does it have to be? What's the price for my daughter's life? Tell me. I want to know the exact dollar amount my baby was worth. Robert had no answer for that. Nobody did. But what happened next? What happened in the deep hours of August 19th, while the town argued and the river bled? That's when the true horror began. The containment ravine behind the consolidated chemical plant was 200 feet deep and half a mile long, carved into the mountain by dynamite and desperation during the plant's hasty wartime construction. It was lined theoretically with concrete and clay, designed to hold industrial waste until it could be properly processed and neutralized. That was the theory. The reality was that properly processed meant diluted enough to not be immediately fatal, and neutralized meant dumped when nobody was paying attention. For 5 years, the ravine had been filling steadily with the byproducts of chemical manufacturing. Heavy metals, aromatic compounds, acids, bases, organic solvents, and things that didn't have names outside technical manuals because they only existed as industrial accidents. The ravine was never meant to hold this much. But wartime manufacturing had become peacetime production, and production quotas had doubled, then tripled, and nobody wanted to ask questions about where the waste went as long as the dyes kept shipping and the profits kept flowing. On August 14th, 3 days before the river began to change, a night watchman at the plant noticed cracks in the ravine's western wall. He filed a report. The report was acknowledged. Nothing was done. On August 16th, those cracks widened. The clay beneath the concrete began to soften, to liquefy, undermined by years of chemical infiltration. And in the early hours of August 19th, 1947, while Elkmouth slept uneasily and argued in dreams, the ravine wall failed. It didn't collapse all at once. That might have been better, cleaner, a single catastrophic event that could be understood and contained. Instead, it failed slowly, insidiously, over the course of 6 hours. Crack by crack, seam by seam, the wall wept poison. 5 years of accumulated industrial waste, approximately 3 million gallons of toxic sludge, began to flow into Sugar Creek, which fed into the Elk River 2 miles downstream. This was what had turned the river rust, colored on August 17th. This was what had killed the fish, had burned Emily Grace Thornton's skin, had sickened 24 people. But that initial leak was just the beginning. The breach in the ravine wall was growing, and with each hour, more waste found its way to the water. By dawn on August 19th, the Elk River had turned a deep, arterial red. Not metaphor, not exaggeration. Red like blood, thick and viscous, flowing downstream with a chemical reek that made people vomit from 100 yards away. And in that crimson water, 42 more people would die over the next 72 hours. Dr. Matthias Webb had been awake for 36 hours straight when he finally understood what he was facing. In his small clinic, he'd treated 7 cases of acute chemical poisoning. In Charleston Memorial Hospital, doctors were seeing dozens more, and the pattern was becoming horrifyingly clear. The toxicity wasn't uniform. That was the insidious nature of the contamination. The poison in the river varied in concentration depending on when and where the water was drawn. Someone who'd used river water on August 17th might have mild symptoms, nausea, headache, skin irritation. Someone who used it on August 19th might die screaming in agony as their organs failed one by one. The chemicals in the river included, and Matthias read this from a hastily compiled list that state chemists had telegraphed down, aniline, benzene, toluene, chromium hexavalent, various mercury compounds, sulfuric acid, and approximately 70 other substances for which there were no standard treatment protocols. You couldn't treat this. You couldn't neutralize it. You could only try to keep people alive long enough for their bodies to filter out what could be filtered, to survive what could be survived. Most couldn't. Sarah Perkins, 68, who'd washed dishes in river water on August 18th. Liver and kidney failure, died August 20th. James Monroe, 34, who'd bathed his children in river water before the warnings spread widely. Neurological collapse, died August 21st. Helen Kincaid, 49, who'd done nothing more than walk through river mist on a morning stroll. Respiratory failure, died August 21st. The list grew and grew and grew. By August 20th, state officials had finally arrived. They cordoned off the river, posted guards, distributed bottled water, began the impossible task of documenting what had happened. They went to the Consolidated Chemical Plant with federal marshals and court orders. What they found in the ravine made grown men weep. The breach had widened to 30 feet across. An estimated 1.7 million gallons of toxic waste had escaped into Sugar Creek over 3 days. The remaining 1.3 million gallons sat behind walls that were still cracking, still failing, still threatening to release even more death into the water. Curtis J. Harrison, plant manager, was arrested on August 21st. So were 3 other senior executives who'd been alerted to the ravine damage and had done nothing. Robert Ellis Calhoun, who'd filed maintenance reports about the ravine walls that were ignored, was not arrested, but he would carry that survivor's guilt for the rest of his life. The plant was shut down immediately. Federal emergency crews worked around the clock to stabilize the ravine, to build berms and barriers, to somehow contain what remained. But the damage was done. 3 days of poison had flowed into the Elk River, and that poison had traveled downstream through 5 counties, contaminating wells, killing livestock, destroying fisheries, and taking human lives with cold indifference. The final death toll from the consolidated chemical disaster: 40, 3 people dead, 80, 7 hospitalized with varying degrees of chemical poisoning, 16 of whom would suffer permanent organ damage, neurological impairment, or cancer that would claim them years later. 40, 3 lives. In 3 days. Because somewhere, someone had decided that profit mattered more than safety, that production quotas mattered more than human life, that a small town in a West Virginia valley was an acceptable sacrifice to make. But the true horror wasn't just the deaths. It was what came after. The trial of Curtis J. Harrison and his co-defendants began in March of 1948 in federal court in Charleston. It lasted 6 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming. Documented reports of ravine degradation ignored, safety protocols violated, waste disposal regulations flagrantly disregarded, multiple warnings from employees dismissed. The defense's strategy was remarkable in its audacity. They argued that the deaths were unfortunate but not criminal, that industrial accidents were a tragic but inevitable part of progress, that the defendants had acted within the norms of their industry and could not have reasonably foreseen the specific failure that occurred. These men are not murderers, defense attorney Charles Whitmore declared in his closing argument. They are patriots who operated a facility crucial to national defense. Did mistakes occur? Yes. Were protocols imperfect? Certainly. But criminal negligence? No. What we have here is a tragedy, not a crime. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Curtis J. Harrison, guilty of gross negligence resulting in death. Sentence: 7 years in federal prison. Thomas Aldridge, chief engineer, guilty of criminal negligence. Sentence: 4 years. Victor Chen, operations director, guilty of environmental violations. Sentence: 2 years. Martin Kessler, safety manager, acquitted due to evidence that he'd repeatedly warned superiors and been overruled. 7 years for 43 lives, approximately 2 months per death. The civil suits that followed were more successful financially. Consolidated Chemical Corporation was ordered to pay $6.2 million in damages to victims and their families. The company declared bankruptcy 3 months later, reorganized under a different name, and reopened a facility in Georgia 2 years after that. The ravine behind the defunct Elk River plant was eventually encased in concrete and clay, a tomb for poison that would remain toxic for centuries. The site was declared a federal Superfund location in 1983. It remains one to this day. And Elkmouth died too, just more slowly. The exodus began in autumn of 1947. Families who'd lost children, parents, spouses couldn't bear to stay in the valley where the river ran. Others left because the river itself was dead, the fishing industry gone, the water unsafe, the very source of life transformed into a source of death. By 1950, The population had dropped to 143. By 1960, 78. By 1970, 31. The last permanent resident of Elkmouth, a woman named Rebecca Morris, who'd been born there in 1904 and refused to abandon her family's homestead, died in December of 1993. She was 89 years old. The town was officially incorporated in 1996. The buildings were left to rot, slowly reclaimed by the mountains that had witnessed everything. But some things don't rot. Some things persist. In 2014, a team of environmental researchers from West Virginia University conducted soil and water testing around the former Elk River chemical plant site. They found heavy metal contamination in the groundwater at levels thousands of times above safe drinking limits. They found soil so toxic that nothing would grow in it, not even the resilient kudzu that covers most abandoned Appalachian structures. And they found something else. In the riverbed itself, buried under decades of sediment, there were layers of red. Not rust, not iron oxide, but actual crystallized chemical residue preserved in the mud like geological strata, a permanent record of those 3 days in August when the river turned to blood. It's like a scar, lead researcher Dr. Patricia Hammond told reporters. The river tried to heal itself, tried to flush the poison out, but it left this mark, this memory. Some wounds go too deep to ever fully heal. The survivors scattered across America, carrying their trauma with them. Catherine Thornton, who lost Emily, moved to Oregon and never spoke her daughter's name aloud again until she died in 2007. Her obituary made no mention of Elkmouth, made no mention of how her daughter died, just survived by 2 sons, 7 grandchildren, and memories she chose to keep private. Robert Ellis Calhoun, the plant supervisor who tried to reassure people even as the poison flowed, quit the chemical industry entirely. He became a teacher, of all things, spending 30 years teaching high school chemistry in rural Virginia. Former students remember him as intense, almost obsessive about safety protocols, about the responsibility that comes with knowledge of dangerous substances. He used to tell us, one former student recalled, every chemical you handle, every procedure you perform, could kill someone if you're careless. Never forget that. Never let profit or pressure or pride make you forget. That lives depend on you doing this right. We thought he was just being dramatic. We didn't know. Sheriff Coleman Briggs remained in Elkmouth until the end, one of the last to leave. He'd tried to fight the plant, tried to hold someone accountable, tried to protect his town. But some enemies are too big to fight with a badge and good intentions. He died in 1986, and his children buried him next to the dried bed of Sweetwater Creek, where the water had once run clear. His headstone reads simply, "He did what he could." Here's what they didn't tell you at the time. Here's what took decades to emerge from sealed documents and suppressed reports and testimonies that came to light only after the principals were safely dead. The executives at Consolidated Chemical knew about the ravine degradation not for days, but for months. Internal memos, released during a 2008 historical investigation, show that engineering staff had warned of catastrophic failure risk. As early as March of 1947, 5 months before the disaster, the federal government knew. Wartime oversight agencies had received reports about waste disposal issues, but classified them as matters of national security, shielding the plant from state environmental inspections. And the deaths could have been prevented, not the initial contamination. That was already underway when Emily Grace Thornton went to collect river stones, but the subsequent deaths. If warnings had gone out immediately, if the company had been honest about what was in their waste, if emergency protocols had been activated. Dozens of lives could have been saved, but transparency would have meant admitting negligence, would have meant stock prices plummeting, would have meant federal contracts canceled, would have meant executives held accountable. So instead, they prevaricated. Delayed, minimized, reassured, and 43 people died. This is the part where I'm supposed to tell you that justice was eventually served, that the truth eventually prevailed, that the arc of history bent toward righteousness. But that would be a lie. Curtis J. Harrison served 4 years of his 7-year sentence before being released for good behavior. He died in 1973, comfortable and wealthy, having invested wisely the money he'd made from his years in the chemical industry. Consolidated Chemical Corporation's successor company is still in operation today, manufacturing industrial chemicals under a different name. They've never formally acknowledged the Elkmouth disaster. Their corporate history, as published on their website, begins in 1952. The families of the victims received an average of $144,000 each from the bankruptcy settlement. Emily Grace Thornton's life, by this accounting, was worth approximately $144,000. About $8,000 per year she didn't get to live. The site of Elkmouth is now owned by the federal government, part of a larger Superfund cleanup zone. Access is restricted. The roads have been barricaded. The buildings have collapsed. Nature has reclaimed the valley, though the poison remains in the soil, in the groundwater, in the very bones of the earth. And the river, the Elk River, still flows. It's been declared safe for fishing since 1996, safe for recreational contact since 2003. The dilution of decades, the filtration of floods, the patient work of bacteria and chemistry, all have done their work. But if you know where to look, if you dig deep enough into the sediment, you'll find those layers of red. That permanent scar, that testimony in stone that says, "This happened, people died here, and nobody was held truly accountable." To this day, there are old-timers in the valleys of West Virginia who remember August of 1947. Not many. Time has taken most of the witnesses, but some remain, and they carry memories that don't fade. They remember the smell, that chemical reek that infiltrated everything, that made you taste metal on your tongue days later. They remember the color, how the water seemed to glow in certain lights, how it looked wrong in a way that transcended simple description. They remember the fear, how trust evaporated in 72 hours, how a community that had survived the Depression and the war fell apart when the thing that sustained them turned to poison. And they remember the silence that came after, how the story was buried, forgotten, erased from history books and public memory, how it became one more sacrifice on the altar of progress, one more community deemed expendable in the grand calculus of industrial America. In 2019, a group of descendants of Elkmouth victims attempted to have a historical marker placed at the former town site, commemorating what happened there. The application was denied by the State Historical Commission due to insufficient documentation and lack of significant historical impact. Insufficient documentation. 43 death certificates, hundreds of pages of court testimony, thousands of pages of environmental reports, photographs that still exist in state archives, but insufficient, because power decides what's sufficient. Because corporations have lawyers and lobbyists and public relations firms that work very hard to ensure that certain stories stay buried. The marker was never erected. But let me tell you something that will haunt you far more than the deaths themselves, more than the negligence, more than the injustice. In 1959, 12 years after the Elkmouth disaster, another chemical plant experienced a similar containment failure. This one in Tennessee. 4 people died. The company was fined. No executives went to prison. In 1976, a chemical storage tank in northern Michigan leaked into groundwater. 11 deaths. Company paid damages, reorganized, continued operations. In 2008, a coal ash spill in eastern Tennessee released 1.1 billion gallons of toxic slurry into a river system. Miraculously, no immediate deaths, though dozens of workers involved in the cleanup developed cancers in subsequent years. In 2014-60, 7 years after Elkmouth, a chemical storage facility leaked into the Elk River again. Different location, different company, different chemical, but the same river. 300,000 residents in Charleston were told not to drink their water. The company declared bankruptcy. No executives went to prison. We keep learning the same lesson. We keep paying the same price. We keep deciding that certain communities, certain rivers, certain lives are acceptable losses in the name of progress and profit. And the question that should keep you awake tonight, is this: when does it stop? When do we decide that no community is expendable? That no river should run red? That no calculation can justify poisoning the water that sustains life itself? Or do we just keep moving on, keep forgetting, keep sacrificing the powerless on the altar of the powerful, until there's nowhere left that hasn't been poisoned, no water that's truly safe, no place that hasn't been deemed acceptable collateral damage? Here's what remains of Elkmouth today. If you know where to look, and I'm not going to tell you exactly where, because the site is dangerous and legally restricted, you can still find foundations, stone walls that once held homes, the remains of the general store's front steps, the cemetery, surprisingly well preserved, where Emily Grace Thornton lies beneath a stone angel that time has weathered but not erased. The river flows past it all, cold and clear, seemingly innocent. Fish have returned, bass and trout, reclaiming waters their ancestors fled 77 years ago. Trees grow thick on the mountainsides. Deer come down to drink at dawn. Nature, patient and persistent, has done what it always does: covered the wounds, hidden the scars, made the deadly beautiful again. But the poison is still there, in the soil, in the sediment, in layers of red that won't erode for 1,000 years. And sometimes, this is what the occasional hiker reports, the ones who ignore the federal warnings and the barricades, sometimes when the light hits the river at certain angles, when the water runs low in summer drought, you can see it, that faint discoloration, that hint of red still bleeding from the banks where Sugar Creek once emptied in. Most dismiss it as mineral staining, rust from ancient iron deposits, tricks of light and shadow, but some know better. Let me tell you about the last conversation I had while researching this story. It was with a woman I'll call Sarah, not her real name, because she asked me not to use it. She's 83 years old now, living in a nursing home in Florida, about as far from West Virginia as you can get while staying in the eastern United States. Sarah was 12 years old in August of 1947. She lived in Elkmouth. Her father worked at the chemical plant. Her best friend was Emily Grace Thornton. We were supposed to go to the river together that day. Sarah told me, her hands trembling slightly as she held a photograph of 2 young girls in summer dresses. Emily and me, but my mother made me stay home to help with canning. I begged, I cried, I threw a tantrum, and my mother wouldn't budge. The berries will spoil, she said. Emily will be there tomorrow. Sarah paused for a long time. When she continued, her voice was barely a whisper. There was no tomorrow for Emily, and I've spent 77 years trying to understand if I was saved by divine intervention, by random chance, by blackberry preserves that needed making. I don't know, I'll never know, but I know that it should have been both of us on those river stones, should have been both of us collecting agates, should have been both of us, if the universe had any logic at all. She looked at me then, her eyes still sharp despite her age. You want to know what the worst part is? It's not the grief. Grief fades, becomes manageable, becomes something you can live with. It's the forgetting, how quickly people forgot, how thoroughly it was erased. I moved away in 1953, and by then, people I met had never heard of Elkmouth, had no idea what had happened there. And when I tried to tell them, they'd look uncomfortable and change the subject, like I was bringing up something distasteful, something that wasn't appropriate for polite conversation. Why? I asked. Because it's easier, she said simply. Easier to forget than to confront what it means. If we remember Elkmouth, we have to ask why it happened. We have to ask why it keeps happening. We have to ask why we let it happen. And those are uncomfortable questions with uncomfortable answers. She handed me the photograph, Emily Grace Thornton. She said she loved river stones and bird songs and her grandmother's blackberry pie. She was 6 years old. She died in agony because someone, somewhere, decided that profit mattered more than her life. Say her name, print it. Make sure someone remembers. That's all we have left. The names, the stories, the insistence that this happened and mattered and should never happen again. I have that photograph in front of me now. 2 girls in summer dresses, squinting against the sun, smiling at whoever held the camera. One of them never made it to 13, never fell in love, never graduated high school, never had children, never grew old. One of them is 83 years old, carrying guilt she doesn't deserve and memories she can't escape, surviving in that peculiar hell reserved for those who witness horror and live to tell the tale. This is what the Historical Commission deemed insufficient historical impact. The story of the river that turned red for 3 days remains, to those few who remember, a mystery wrapped in documented facts. We know what happened. We have the reports, the death certificates, the testimonies, the photographs. But we don't know, not really, what made it possible. Not the mechanics of ravine failure and chemical dispersal, but the deeper question, what made it acceptable? What made 43 deaths in a West Virginia valley seem like a reasonable price for continued production? What made Curtis J. Harrison look at warnings about ravine degradation and decide that addressing them wasn't worth the cost or delay? What made us, as a society, shrug and move on? These questions remain unanswered. Perhaps they're unanswerable. Perhaps the honest answer is too disturbing to contemplate. That we've decided, collectively and quietly, that some people don't matter as much as others. That some communities are expendable. That the prosperity of the many justifies the sacrifice of the few. And if that's the answer, if that's what we've become, then the river that runs red is just a symptom. The real poison is in us, in our willingness to look away, to forget, to deem certain deaths acceptable collateral damage in the grand machinery of progress. To this day, the federal government maintains the Superfund site where Elkmouth once stood. The cleanup, such as it is, continues. The estimated completion date, 275, 250, 1 years of remediation for 3 days of poisoning. And even then, they say, the site will never be truly clean. Some contamination is permanent. Some wounds never heal. Some scars remain written in stone, in sediment, in the very bones of the earth. Testimony to what happened here and what we allowed to happen. The river flows on, clear now, or seemingly so, but dig deep enough and you'll find those layers of red. That permanent reminder, that question that won't be buried no matter how much dirt we pile on top. What are we willing to sacrifice? And when we make that sacrifice, who gets to decide it's worth it? If this journey into the valley where the river ran red has unsettled you, and it should unsettle you, if you find yourself lying awake tonight thinking about Emily Grace Thornton collecting river stones, about communities destroyed by decisions made in distant boardrooms, about the terrible arithmetic that values profit over human life, then this channel has more truths waiting in the shadows. Subscribe if you're willing to confront the stories we've buried, the histories we've erased, the questions we've deemed too uncomfortable to ask. Leave a like if this account provoked something deeper than entertainment, if it made you question who decides what lives matter and what deaths are acceptable. And in the comments, I want to know, if you had lived in Elkmouth, if you had worked at that plant, if you had known about the ravine damage but faced losing your job, your income, your family, security, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up? Would you have stayed silent? Would you have convinced yourself it was probably fine, that the experts knew what they were doing, that one person couldn't make a difference anyway? It's easy to judge from 77 years distance. It's harder to know what we'd do in that moment, facing that choice, with everything we love on the line. But we should know, because that choice hasn't gone away. It's still being made in different forms in different valleys, by different people with the same basic calculation. Safety versus profit, lives versus production, speaking up versus keeping quiet. The river runs clear now, but the question remains, and it's flowing toward us all. When does progress become poison? When does silence become complicity? And when we see the water turning red, in whatever form that takes, will we have the courage to shout a warning, even if it costs us everything? Until next time, remember the most terrifying stories aren't the ones about what happened then. They're the ones about what's happening now, to someone, somewhere in a valley we'll never see, to a river whose name we don't know. Yet the water is always clear, until suddenly it isn't, and by then, it's too late to do anything but count the dead and try to learn lessons we never seem to remember. Emily Grace Thornton was 6 years old. Say her name, remember.